All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Caffeine Stream. My name is CB Robertson. This is episode 57, and I'm joined by Dan, aka O3 OG, to talk about um, power, influence, and perhaps Israel. Um, Israel is an interesting subject. It's something that's been peripherally on my own political radar for about 6 or 7 years now. Um,
Okay.
it's a dangerous subject to talk about, though, depending on what you want to say. But power and
Indeed.
politics and influence in general can be dangerous things to talk about or to get too involved in. I mean, this is nominally a philosophy show. Philosophy in the West, anyways, was more or less kickstarted into the public eye by a man who was formally executed by the state for being a philosopher, essentially. So it's not anything that's limited to Israel, but
Yeah.
Israel does seem to be a particularly touchy subject. And I mean, I've been following Dan for some months now. We talking about a variety of issues, and you've been uh diving into this subject. It looks like a fair bit, especially after the October 7th attacks. Um, so Dan, would you
Yeah.
mind introducing yourself? What's your background and what got you into exploring the dark, murky waters of politics and power?
Well, hey, Chris, thanks first and foremost for having me on. I've been looking forward to this conversation for a long time. So, uh, Daniel Clancy is my name. Where do I begin? I don't want to get too deep into my story because it's not that important, but I spent about almost 16 years in the Marine Corps infantry. Deployed a bunch overseas, all over the Pacific, and I'm currently in the Army National Guard as an 11 Bravo as an infantryman, and I'll actually be hitting my 20th year in service this year, and probably looking at either getting retired medically in the next year or retiring on my own accord in the next probably year or two. So um, I I got a wife and two children. Um, I used to compete in powerlifting for a little bit. I have some pretty decent lifts and totals. Um, and I would say what's gotten me into politics. Oh man, that's I my dad told me gave me a quote or an idea. He told me to, question everything as a young child. And ironically, that ended, with me questioning the faith that he brought me up in and ultimately leaving that as well.
It's very
And
dangerous
then
advice.
yeah, yeah, like and so but I think, you know, starting at a young age, I grew up without a lot. Didn't have a TV even or anything like that. So I don't go to the library a lot to read comic books and stuff like that. And, I just got really into, even in high school, like into conspiracies and questioning the 9/11 narrative and, listening to Immortal Technique and other, listening to First Blood and System of Down and other music that kind of, um, encourage that type of thinking. And so, kind of counterintuitively, I joined the Marine Corps still and, needed that direction in my life at the time. And I'm grateful for that. But, as I got older and as I started questioning things more and more, and questioning ultimately why I was being continued to ask to, go over to the Middle East and do these things. And, I just started really being upset because ultimately I wasn't seeing anything changing. And uh, I just, every rabbit hole I went down would just go into a deeper, darker rabbit hole about our government. And so it's brought me to a lot of places and ultimately just, questioning the narrative that's been given to us as far as power and influence, and especially today with Israel and that being such a touchy subject for people. and the power and influence that they have and that they've had over our country and our politicians for the last, 50 to 60 years, 70 years. Um, and so that's my little intro. I hope I didn't get too long-winded.
Yeah, no, it's great. And it's funny because I mean, my decision to join the military, the Navy in my case, in 2009, I'd been accepted to a university out of high school, and I didn't go, and I joined the Navy instead. And my logic was, in senior year of high school, I was beginning to get interested in philosophy and in politics, and
Okay.
I discovered Christopher Hitchens, who caught my eye because he changed his mind on a subject after going through some personal experience. He had written something in defense of waterboarding, and then
Mm.
out of journalistic curiosity and integrity, decided to have himself waterboarded by some professionals, and it was caught on video. You can go on YouTube and watch Christopher Hitchens be waterboarded. No, it wasn't what killed him. And and after being waterboarded, he thought a lot about it, and he wrote he changed his mind. He said, I think this is actually wrong now. And not because it's super painful and oh gosh, I don't want it. But he's like, having been through that, I can see now that if I was doing this, I would say anything to make this stop. There's no way that information, you know, uh, extricated from people through this means could be considered reliable, because I know what I would do in this, situation. And like, say what you want about waterboarding, pro and against. I think there are probably good arguments in both directions, but that kind of integrity was it seemed very unusual to me, which is maybe concerning in its own way, but also very correct and inspiring. And my own logic for joining the military was, if I'm going to have opinions on these kinds of things, I should have some skin in the game. I should have actually been there. If I'm going to at some point be willing to advocate war, I shouldn't be a chicken hawk, at the very
Mm.
least. I shouldn't be advocating for this without having ever been uh, you know, had something at stake. Now, uh, it is perhaps an irony that a lot of the most firm and persistent anti-war advocates are also veterans.
That
It's
is
not
it is
something.
very interesting how
Yeah,
that
it's
works.
not universal. The military is full of a broad range of kinds of people, but it does seem to turn a lot of people into anti-war activists who were maybe a little bit more agnostic or apathetic before.
Yeah, that's I a lot of people always ask me, like, why, Dan, why'd you join? And because at the time I didn't, like I said, a lot of my friends were like, you're joining the Marine Corps. And then originally, I started working in the kitchen when I was like 14 years old, washing dishes. Sorry, 15, washing dishes, and worked my way kind of up the ladder through high school. And then my senior year of high school, I went to a vocational school for culinary arts. And my goal was to go to the Culinary Institute of America up in Hyde Park, New York, and get my degree there. And unfortunately, that's a very prestigious school, and it costs a lot of money. So I didn't have that ability to go, and I didn't want to go into debt or try to go into debt to do it. So I was, kind of killed two birds with one stone, because I also, my whole life, my dad, even though he didn't want me to join the military, he always praised the military. He was in the Navy. His father was in the Navy. And he always, my dad was just kind of that survival. He was just he was an interesting guy, but kind of had that warrior spirit inside of him, and passed that along to me. And so I had this idea, kind of like you, or hey, I want to be a warrior. I want to know what it's like to take a life. I want to feel, obviously I think I was very immature and naive to think I would want that.
Who isn't when
But
they're 17 or 18?
right, and that's another whole nother power and influence road we could go down, because we're all very young, impressionable young men with raging testosterone levels. And what a perfect group of people to recruit to go fight.
Yeah.
um and so I wanted to go do that, and I wanted to go be infantry, and I wanted to go do special operations. Ultimately, that was my goal. I wanted to go be the GI Joe, and so that ended up not happening because of some other medical issues as well. But it yeah, it's very interesting.
Yeah. It's funny. And because when you're in the military, you kind of come to, I think a certain kind of person anyways will sort of come to realize the role they service. They are the arms of political forces. You feel like you're an arm of the Constitution, that you're defending, you swear an oath to, defend the Constitution from all enemies, foreign and domestic, and we're defending freedom and all this kind of thing. And then after you sort of spend some time in what is essentially a functionally fascistic culture, um,
Mm.
and and see like where you're going and the reasons why and so forth, you're like, this seems to have very little to do with freedom or the Constitution. it's it's not it's not good. It's not necessarily evil either. It's just kind of this other thing. um
Yeah.
and uh you realize what you're becoming a part of. uh I can see why it would lead a lot of people coming out of the military to be like, well, what is this other thing? What is the nature of the power which was using me as its arms? And how does it work and where does it come from and so forth? And I think we don't even need to talk about Israel yet, because there's lots of things that the military and police, I think it applies to law enforcement as well, but the military is a little more on the nose, um, that are in Latin America, in Asia, in our own area. We have National Guard in New York subways now, apparently. Um,
Yeah.
that has very little to do with Israel. At least, I mean, it's not those tunnels in New York. It's the other tunnels. Um,
Yeah.
so
Wait, they may have guards in both tunnels.
well, who knows? Uh,
No, those ones didn't have tunnels. There's only one tunnel. There was no tunnels. There was no tunnels.
these are not the droids you're looking for.
You are not the. It is not the juice you're looking for.
I said droids. What'd you say?
I
Oh,
said
we're
something
jumping the
gun.
gun.
I'm sorry. I had.
No, no,
I
I'm
had
I'm
to.
giving you a hard time. Um,
I had to do it.
uh, but
Well, these.
so
Yeah.
what has your experience been of, this exploration? You said it began with 9/11, um, which is um, it seems to be maybe not the beginning, but at least one of the first large, um, large cases of violence or domestic terrorism, or not domestic terrorism, um, where the uh, where the investigation has been a lot more opaque than I think the public would like. I am not sold on most of the 9/11 truth
Me neither.
stuff. I don't think it was an ICBM. I don't think it was an inside job from George Bush. I think it makes very intuitive sense that it is, exactly the people who claimed credit for it for the reasons that they gave because of the history of Islam. It's very easy to look up what they want and why and so forth. There's like a 1400-year pattern there, but that doesn't mean that the 9/11 Commission report was completely forthcoming about everything. And I think Vivek Ramaswamy, of all people, um, has actually been very potent in challenging the legitimacy of the official story. of 9/11,
Mm.
and you don't need to be, you know, grouped into the caricature of a tinfoil hat brigade. You don't need to
Mm.
to put on the dunce cap that they want you to wear in order to
Yes.
doubt the completeness and accuracy of the official story.
Yeah, and I think it's unfortunate that, and I think it's also by design, probably, I'm sure that, when you begin to question some of these narratives and some of these things, and you point out inconsistencies, and you can say, well, hey, this isn't right. Like, people automatically blanket you with, oh, you must be one of those tinfoil hat guys. And
Yeah.
it sucks even more because I'm not gonna say all the time, but most of the time, most of the things that you hear that about later on become true. And
Right.
so it's like almost like, again, going back to influence and power, bringing it back, like, we've both spoken about Edward Bernays and propaganda and
Mm-hmm.
the propaganda machine. And so it's like, I believe that a lot of that, I'm not one of those ones that's like, oh, conspiracy theorist was made by the CIA. No, that term wasn't coined by the CIA. That's a lie and a disinformation in itself and
Oh,
dishonest.
is it?
But
I didn't know that.
yeah,
I thought it
I was
was.
reading.
Interesting.
Yeah, I can't remember the exact history, and I shouldn't have brought it up because I'm going to sound like an idiot now. But it was basically explaining how, like, that wasn't exactly at all how the CIA ever didn't do that. It was kind of like one of those things that just kind of got repeated a million times, and people were like, oh yeah, that's the way it happened. And like a lot of quotes, I think, too, a lot of people, that's very famous with, like, Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin and all these
Yeah.
other famous people who, they're like, oh, they said that. Like, no, they didn't say that. They didn't say it at all. But
I
you know
saw you bringing up the Ben Franklin quote about those who would give up a little liberty for a little bit of security will deserve and receive neither. It's like maybe the worst misquotation in the
yes,
entire
yeah.
American canon. Anyone who wants to look up the letter and the context of that 1755, was it, letter, something like that, from the Pennsylvania General Assembly to the Penn family. I was like, the connotation is almost exactly the opposite of how
Yeah,
Europeans use
I
that.
was gonna say, wasn't his context more or less him advocating for government to take over in the event that they need to provide security, right? Am I
Not
mistaken?
quite government takeover. What they were trying to do, there was a persistent skirmishes and raiding with the local Amerindian tribes. It was like
Yeah.
building up into what might have been a full scale war. And so they
Okay.
wanted to raise taxes in order to equip and train the local militias. We need weapons, we
Okay.
need training and practice and all this stuff. We need money to do that, so they wanted to raise taxes. But the Penn family, who and maybe this will be our segue into power and influence. The Penn family,
Hmm.
who owned Pennsylvania, they were the like charter governors or whatever, because it was still England at the time. Um, didn't live in Pennsylvania; they lived in Virginia, but they owned a lot of land in Pennsylvania, and it was an understanding that the Penn family's lands were not to be taxed.
Okay.
But the Pennsylvania General Assembly needed to raise taxes to fight the Indians. So they said, we know this is custom not to tax you, but we're going to do it. And the Penn family was very upset about that. And Ben Franklin wrote this letter to say, look, you can't, your desire for security from taxes, the
Mm.
security was not physical security.
Physical security,
It
yeah.
was security from taxes, is
Mm.
getting in the way of freedom in the sense of self-governance. At the
Self-government, owning
time,
land, owning property, all that.
freedom meant the freedom of the people to govern themselves, which included the right to come together and raise a levy in order to pay for arms and training. So
Okay.
the freedom actually equated to taxation. But now self-imposed, self-governed taxation, but taxation nonetheless, that the political class wanted security from, wanted uh, exclusion from. Security meant freedom from taxes, and freedom meant the right to govern, to participate in the governing process.
It
And
paints a whole new picture to people,
yeah,
like
the
that's
way
like,
libertarians
it's a
use it now, it's like
completely, yeah.
freedom from taxes and security is physical security from like
A
raiding
tyrant,
tribes or
yeah,
something. So
yeah,
it's funny how that gets now it does still paint a very interesting picture of what free governance looks like. One that we probably don't emulate very well today, to put it mildly. But yeah, the delving into the history of these things is so valuable and interesting and fun, I think, although it can be dangerous,
yeah, that too.
because it just opens up this whole new world. Oh, I know exactly where we're going to go with this now. We're
I
coming
guess.
up with this on the fly.
Well, I was gonna say too, an interesting move or idea that I had was talking about uh, Benjamin Franklin and their family and all of that was, if we want to talk about power and influence too, then we have to talk about Freemasonry, and we have to talk about the Quakers. Like I didn't understand this till I dug deeper. For example, Tun Tavern in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania was the first Masonic hall in the United States, and Tun Tavern also was where the Marine Corps was founded.
Hmm.
And uh, who was it? Lieutenant Presley James O'Bannon, or who's the Archibald Henderson, the granddad of the Marine Corps, the first Marine Corps, or yeah, I'm getting this all fucked up, I think, and I'm gonna get butchered online for it for not knowing this Marine Corps history, but basically the first officer of the Marine Corps and the man who pretty much started the Marine Corps, he was adopted by the mayor of Pennsylvania, who just happened to be a Quaker.
Hmm.
And so, the first person to basically start up the Marine Corps was in was a you know in a Masonic lodge in Philadelphia, and that's where the Marine Corps got founded. So it's very interesting, like you said, the whole power and influence, and talking about obviously Benjamin Franklin, those families, our founding fathers' families were like, they were high ranking people too, not just in society or not just as
Right.
politicians, but as like they had wealth and they had, power and influence.
The I I want to ask a little bit more about the Quakers and the Masonic Lodge connection. But before we do that, I feel like we should take a moment to talk about power and influence in themselves and their relationship to each other. Because, I mean, it's in a philosophy podcast, we should at least try to come up with functioning definitions of these things, at least as we're using them. Power.
I love I love this too, because sorry to interrupt, but I've been talking with what's his name? Uh Jim Bob. You see he's like a comic. He makes comics. He's like
Yeah.
Orthodox. I always rattle his cage. We always go back and forth, and we always go back and forth on the topic of power and influence, because I always bring up the argument of uh he says that the devil has influence over, and I'm like, well, that's not by definition power, but it does create power.
Mhm.
Having influence is a type of power you can have.
Yeah.
And so we always go back and forth about that on that. So maybe that could be a way to tie this into.
Yeah. Oh, I mean, the most basic definition of power is just force. I mean,
Okay.
it's like the physics definition. It's what people mean. It's power is a gun. Power is,
Yeah.
depending on who you are and your welding skills, a bulldozer. Power is the ability to exert force. Um,
Okay.
Influence is like, my understanding of influence is that it's like the ability to affect change on someone else.
So it's
So
not actual force. It's not a physical force, but you could. in you could make someone use force. You could
Yes.
influence someone to use their power.
A king has very little direct power, but he has influence. He has the ability to cause other people to exert force on his behalf, i.e., the military, um,
Yeah.
or the executive branch in its various shadowy capacities. Um, and there's power that exerts influence. There is influence that kind of wields power, but then there is also influence that has no power. Kind of influence that is just kind of a paper tiger kind of thing. And then
Okay.
there's also power that wields very little influence. I'm always reminded of the oh, not always reminded, it's on my mind because I was writing about this recently, the parable of the sun and the north wind. Have you heard of this?
I've not.
It's an old children's story about the sun and the north wind were having a dispute over who was more powerful. And they decided to have a contest. And they say, whoever can make that man down there take his coat off is the stronger. And so the north wind comes and he blows and blows and he blows and he tries to blow the man's coat off. But the man just hugs his coat tighter and races against the wind. And the north wind finally gives up, says, okay, sun, your turn. And the sun just turns up the dial and just beams out warm and bright and makes it into a nice and beautiful day. And the guy just, of his own volition, takes his coat off.
Takes.
The wind, the north wind, has all the force, all the power in the world, but he did not have influence, or maybe not as much influence as he would have liked. So
Okay.
perhaps the moral of the story is lightly misnamed. Maybe it's not who's the stronger, maybe it's who's the more influential. But you know,
I mean
that would ruin the children's story.
I mean it's so deep, but it's also so simple, you
Mhm.
know. And I think, going back just to, military and all that, like our power and influence, like going back to what you were saying about what started to make me question, the 9/11. And funny thing, it was a lot of music. And I remember listening to the song Prison Song by System of Down.
Mm.
And I remember reading the lyrics, because I listened to a lot of metal and a lot of other stuff, and when I wouldn't know what they were saying, so I would read the lyrics, and I want to know what they're saying. They
And
have a good
System of a
message,
Down
supposedly.
is such an incredibly
Spaz.
talented. Well, their sound is quite jarring at first, but
Yeah,
as lyric writers, I don't know who writes the lyrics. I assume it's Serge, but maybe it's one of the
I
other
think
guys.
it's Serge. Yeah.
Just unbelievably talented lyric writers, in my
Yes.
opinion. Just phenomenal
Agreed.
writers.
And so I remember re-listening to that song, the Prison Song, and I remember reading the statistics that he was talking about the incarceration rates in the United States compared to the rest of the world. And that sent me to the library again, to search. And it was, I remember just being so shocked at that, because it was something I was ultimately pretty oblivious to and had no real idea of just how bad the prison industrial complex in the United States had come to. And so that kind of helped kickstart my questioning process, and I guess just doubt in my government.
Yeah.
And then, anyone else that's been in the military knows how government works, so I think you automatically start doubting and questioning the government as a result of military service. But
Doubting the wisdom of the leadership skills of E3s or
just, I mean, we just
or
see
O1s.
yeah, you see, like, you see firsthand just how much power and influence can affect just such a small thing, like the choice of a platoon commander that is inexperienced, that
Yeah.
tells the guys to go do something because he has influence and power. And the squad leader who has, 3 deployments already, who doesn't believe him and tells him to fuck off, uh, it's just, it's very, like I said, it goes back to just being very interesting to watch this dynamic and then ultimately sit back and think about that power and influence as it pertains to our lives. It's awesome. It's really cool.
So I have a question for you on that. There's a famous rule from Lord Acton that power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely. But there is some disagreement over just how true that is. We'll call that like theory A. It's that power by its nature corrupts. Then there's
Okay.
like people come into power and they get high off the experience of power. They become addicted and they need to feel the power of exerting their will over others. It like
Okay.
corrupts their soul. Theory two is no, power doesn't corrupt, but power does attract the corrupt, and like it attracts sociopaths. Um, then there is idea three, which is I think best articulated by this video that I shared with you, but in looking at it briefly before I sent it, my 6-year-old daughter has become obsessed with it and watches it every day now. It's called Rules for Rulers by CGP Grey. And it's basically an 18-minute crash course in Machiavellian political science. It basically says, in order to acquire and maintain power, you actually have to follow the rules of power, or else you will lose it. You will be outcompeted by those who do follow the rules for power. So the nature of power, and here we're really more talking about influence than power, as we
Yeah.
described, but we're going to use it in the colloquial sense here, despite having defined them, because the laws of power is a little bit catchier than the rules of influence in like a Robert
Yeah. Yeah.
Cialdini kind of way. So what is required of power is that you reward your benefactors. There are certain key people that uh, are the keys to power. They are what ensures your staying on the throne, so to speak. And if you do
Okay.
not reward those people, they will put someone else in your place.
Who will reward?
Yeah. So we have theory one, Lord Acton, power corrupts. You get someone empowered, it like turns them into Gollum over time. Uh Position two is no, it draws in the sociopathic and the narcissists and the corrupt. Position three is it isn't so much A or B, is the nature of power is corruption itself. Corruption is what power is. And there isn't actually a distinction. There was never any chance that power was going to not be corrupt. And then option D is no, actually, it's fine. It's just like everyone is resentful of power. I don't think very many people in 2024 hold that position. I
Yeah.
think in some contexts, I think that it's a kind of almost a quasi Nietzschean take. You have a very Nietzsche-esque mustache, so my desire to quote Nietzsche is higher than it already normally is as a baseline.
I
But
love it. I love it. I'm here for it.
there is a temptation to see all these people talking about the corruption of power and say, "Are you just envious that you don't have it?"
Mm.
You know?
I mean, I think if I had to take a position, I mean, I would try to take a little bit of each one, because I think that all of them are true in itself. Like I think it's so, like you said before too, power is a complex and thing, and there's so many ways that you can use it. And I think that, ultimately it's all of those things. And as far as, because again, you think if power corrupts and power corrupts everything and everyone, like, then like you said before, is that just what power does? Is that just, by definition, power is force and force moves things. So you can't have power without it doing some type of corruption, because whether you're on the receiving end or the giving end of power, you probably think your view is right, so
Right.
it's like it's
Yeah.
you who is that power dependent on? Then I feel like then you have to kind of mix in some type of morality,
Yeah.
because someone, I might think that this power is okay, or it's okay for me to use it this way, and you may be like, no, absolutely not. I'm an individual, I have my rights, you don't have power or authority over me. So I think it's once again a super deep complex issue that and thing that is affects so many different ways.
Yeah. Um, I mean, what you're describing, I knew this book would come up. Is the argument made by Thrasymachus in the beginning
Mm.
of the Republic, where he says, "What you call justice is just the interest of the stronger."
Mm.
And
I
everyone
like that.
and everyone, if everyone had the ability, everyone would be a tyrant. But they lack the ability to tyrannize over others, and so they appeal to justice and to
Mm.
notions of fairness because they can't have what they secretly want.
I feel like
And
I've heard that somewhere. Does
yeah,
Nietzsche talk about that, what you're just speaking of? I feel like I've heard all that
yes,
before, like something and something.
we're very much in Nietzsche's domain here, because Nietzsche
Okay.
was all about the what he called the will to power.
Yeah, I was just gonna say I was gonna say
But
that, but
this is why it's important to distinguish power from influence, and like personal power from political power. Influence being
okay.
like political power, because Nietzsche was a huge critic of the state. There's a line in Thus Spake Zarathustra. I wish I had it with me so I could quote it verbatim, where he talks about the state is like the refuge of the superfluous man, or something like that.
Or
And so
does he say the scoundrel? The state is something the scoundrel. I believe another famous. It might have been a
probably
fourth founding father who said something about that, like something about the state being a scoundrel or the something. I forget.
Nietzsche had deep contempt for the state, and I think the power that Nietzsche was, aspiring, was advocating the will to power for, was personal power. And a lot of what he talks about in The Antichrist and in the Genealogy of Morals, because he was an anti-moralist, a self-described
Yeah.
anti-moralist, which is a fancy way of saying he's a virtue ethicist. Um, but basically, it's a more scandalous way of describing yourself as a virtue ethicist. But he says that a lot of this uh, uh, desire to get involved in politics is um, displaced resentment, which is a fancy French word for resentment, um, and hatred. He says the people who, or he would say, weakness corrupts. Power doesn't corrupt. Weakness corrupts, and weakness makes people want to exert influence over others. But in
It kind
personally
of sounds
powerful
like
people, just create a business or build a garden, or exert their power themselves.
I. You can correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe it's Jordan Peterson who might have said something along those lines that it's the weak men that are dangerous. It's not actually strong men that are dangerous, but weak men, and or something like that, or something like I forget.
Yeah.
Someone else might have said something like about those lines of if you if you think this is bad, then you should see what a weak person would do, or something like that, something along those
Yeah.
lines. Like,
He was probably channeling Nietzsche. Jordan Peterson is a I have things I agree with Peterson about and things I disagree with him about, but I really like what he's I like the sense that he's brought Nietzsche into the public within. If
yeah,
you want a great 4-minute auditory experience, go listen to Jordan Peterson read The Tarantulas from Nietzsche's Thus Spake Zarathustra. It's a fantastic reading of it. Um,
good.
it's one of those things, like, I think everybody benefits if they take some time to memorize something that's really meaningful to them. There was a time where I had Christopher Hitchens' full 20-minute Defense of Hate Speech memorized. I don't have it memorized anymore, but
Wow.
some people, I have a friend who I interviewed talking about some similar stuff here. Ben Brower, he talked about anarcho-primitivism. He's been working on memorizing Beowulf in Old English, which I think is cool.
No way.
I learned the first lines of the Iliad in Greek, but you would, you'd be hard pressed to do better than Nietzsche's tarantulas. Um, where he talks about the spirit of resentment in the advocacy of justice and equality. It's just revenge. It's the revenge of the weak. It's the revenge of the nerds, like the movie.
Wow.
Um, the revenge of the nerds is like pure Nietzschean psychology in the 20th 21st century. And so it would make sense that maybe power doesn't corrupt, but perhaps power attracts the corrupt. Maybe that would be Nietzschean sense if we're taking power in the political sense of the term, because it's very easy
Yeah.
to get mixed up with our words here.
Yeah.
Personal power versus political power, which is like influence, and yeah, it's and I think people losing track of those words gets very tricky.
Yeah. I mean, I just off the top of my head when, I was going back and forth with what's his name? Not Jim Bob or whatever his name is. Jimbo, not Jimbo. I don't fucking know, Jim Bob. Um, and I was researching, I pulled up some paper from some university describing power and all the definitions, and I was just like, holy fucking shit, I just blew off. Like my mind was like, I did not realize this was this in depth. And I was like,
Yeah.
I might have bit off a little bit more than I could chew here. And I'm just like trying to scroll through this as fast as I could and get a grasp on, the types of power. And it was too much information. That was like a week of information I should have studied. And I tried to, get it all down in 20 minutes.
It's complex. It's very complex. And I mean, Machiavelli is an interesting sort of character, sort of at the center of this whole thing. And he has his like the poor man's Machiavelli is what is it, like Robert Greene, 48 Laws of Power.
Yeah.
I feel like
I
it's
like some of
like,
his stuff still.
yeah, I'm sure he's got some good stuff. My I have an associative dislike of him because he's good friends with uh Ryan Holiday, who I deeply dislike for
Despise.
for yeah. Um so like that association by itself I think makes him suspect. I read the first couple chapters of the 48 Laws of Power. It's like uh I have very neutral feelings about it. I guess I didn't read enough to have a strong feeling, but um
I read
the
his Seduction, and it was good. The Art of Seduction or the Laws of Seduction or whatever.
oh, interesting. Okay. I might have to
And that was,
look into that then.
yeah, that's a really he really does a good job, I think, with that and just explaining the ways that seduction has been used and throughout history. Because I like that part about him. I do believe he's good at tying in history and famous people and whatnot, and he does a good job of kind of talking about that influence and the influence of seduction on people, and then kind of like how to break down the different types and what type you are. And yeah, I'm sure
So,
there's a lot of fluff
so
thrown
he
in
is
there, but
a so he is a Machiavellian then, in the sense that he's
yeah,
approaching the topic descriptively rather than from a morally prescriptive angle. He says this is not
yes,
how things should be. How
yes,
are things actually?
yeah, yeah, for sure. I would definitely agree with you on that and say that
Yeah.
that's how he approaches them, because he talks about them in a way to be like, you could read this book and learn a lot how to seduce people, and you could be a real asshole and hurt. You could really use that to your advantage, because like the points and the principles that he teaches and uses, like I tell people, you could, like, if you were a chick, and I should tell every one of these chicks doing some type of sex work, that you should understand and read that book, because if you did, you would be 10 times better at your job, because you would understand not only the power you have, but what you're doing and how to, I think if women knew that, we'd be fucked. We'd all be fucked.
Yeah. Well,
if every woman wrote that book, we'd all be fucked. Or read that book, we'd all be screwed.
yeah. And in either word choice, I don't think men would be too upset about it. But
No, not at all. We're easy
I
to
kid.
please like that.
I kid. But I mean, but the other angle to that, of course, is that if men read that book, with an angle of understanding the enemy, so to speak,
Yeah.
um, it can be eye-opening in terms of what to look out for. And so understanding the laws of power, even if you don't want to employ them, can still be useful in terms of understanding how it works. There's a book
Oh, yeah.
by my current favorite political philosopher, a guy named Curtis Yarvin. He recommends, called The Machiavellians by James Burnham.
You
And
got
I
to send
haven't,
them a newsletter.
yeah, I haven't read the whole book. I've only read the first two chapters. But and I keep meaning to get back to it. This is like my entire library is full of books I read the first 15 pages of. Uh, but
You sound like me. You sound exactly like me.
but the first chapter is hilarious because it describes Dante. Everyone knows Dante's Inferno. They are usually not familiar with his second work, De Monarchia, which is a theological political treatise on what the ideal state should look like. And um it, from a theological perspective, it makes no sense. It's not
No
so
sense.
much, it is just not, it's not even illogical in like the physics sense of a statement being not even wrong. It's like this is just a bunch of non sequiturs. What are you even doing?
Nonsense.
And politically it's not much better. Politically it's not much better. It's just this weird treatise that's saying, oh, the Pope should have power, but the prince should be higher for these random disconnected reasons over the city, blah blah blah. And it's like all these appeals to God's angels and such. And what what Burnham does is he seats this work within the context of medieval Italy at the time that Dante was writing. And it turns out there was this big conflict between warring political factions, one side of which was backed by the Pope and the other side was not. And so what this was just straight political propaganda disguised as some semi-theological political treatise. There's the but the ulterior motive behind it could not have been more obvious in
So like a
retrospect.
19 was it like the very first version of 1984, almost like kind of like describing this scenario, or is it not quite like that?
No. It was he was trying to be prescriptive. He was trying to give a prescriptive. Now,
Okay.
there are some governments that have taken 1984 as a kind of prescriptive document, but we're not going to talk
Yeah.
about them. Um,
Yeah.
this is, yeah, this is him trying to say this is what a government should look like if we're to be real Christians under God. And what James Burnham does is explain which side of the faction Dante was on and why this clearly was just propaganda for his own side. And everyone, I think, even people with like high school familiarity with the Inferno and like which pope was in which circle of hell that was contemporary with Dante at the time, it's like that's also propaganda a little bit. But what he does with this is he's introducing the Italian school of political theory notion of a political formula, which is not a logical argument. It's not a like a logical axiom or some theory of how things are supposed to be. It's a rationalization or a justification for power. It's a justification for why the people in power have power.
What is it go into why they need to have power, like from a moral standpoint? Like, we need to have this because this won't happen almost?
That could be a political formula. You could say, if you remove me from power, then the sun god Ra will withdraw his blessings upon our North Nile kingdom. That could be
Okay.
that could be one political formula. Um, Another political formula could be, I won the election. You know, there are and none of these are like right or wrong. To get caught up in is it correct or incorrect is to kind of miss the point. The point is,
Yeah.
does it work? And so if you read De Monarchia as a theological treatise, you're going to be scratching your head like crazy, being like, what the fuck is this? This doesn't make any sense. If you read it in the correct genre, though, which is as a political formula, it's basically a magic spell. Um,
Wow.
uh, then it makes a lot more sense. And then the judgment of, is it a good political formula or a bad political formula, is not like, is there logical congruity between the axioms and the conclusions? It's, what is the effect that these words have on the demos, or on the aristocrats, or the important party to persuade? Does it work? Because I mean, that's been my impression when I read snippets of, like, I think I've read a grand total of like 4 or 5 sentences from one of Barack Obama's books. I don't remember
I've
which
never.
one it was. There was a couple, and to me, all political uh characters books kind of sound the same. I haven't read a lot of them, so I'm sure there are some exceptions, but um, I've read the first couple pages of Mein Kampf, which a couple of people have suggested I read, and I have to say it strikes me in kind of the same way. It has this same
Yeah.
kind of like, this is political talk language to it. This is an attempt at a political formula. Looking back historically, I think we can say objectively that Mein Kampf was a very, very effective political formula. And that's
For
obviously
sure.
an amoral claim, because that's what political science is by definition. It's amoral. Um, so, like, studying politics through this amoral lens seems to make a lot more sense of why people are saying the sorts of things that they say. And because you look at a lot of these politicians, these political viewpoints, and you're like, this is incoherent. Why are you're arguing A here and not A here? I think we should have uh you know uh gun control for American citizens, but immigrants should have the right to own guns. uh this is clearly a double standard. How can you explain that? And it's like, the double standards are what you apply to logical positions. Double standards almost have nothing to do with political positions, where it's just about pleasing your constituency blocks.
Now, bringing it, when you look, talking about Mein Kampf and, Hitler, and obviously there's so much that goes into the rise and power of that and the power and influence that he had. And a lot of people talk about the pendulum effect of, you know, leftism and fascism, and how kind of Germany got to that point. My
Mhm.
question for you would be, do you think Do you see that happening here in the United States with Trump and the leftism that is occurring? Do you think that we're kind of repeating history here? I'm not saying that Trump is Hitler. No, that's not what I'm saying. But I think he has the potential, or because of this pendulum effect, do you think there is potential for a rise of some type of authoritarian because of it?
Yeah, I mean, off the bat, I don't think we're ever going to see another Hitler. Hitler was one of a
Yeah,
kind. Alexander the Great, Napoleon were ones of a kind, and those are not to compare those three because they're all their own thing. I think Hitler was one of a kind. Will we get an authoritarian like strongman type? I mean, unless you assume that America is somehow immune from the political patterns that apply everywhere else in the world, that seems to be the only way it can go. Um, you know, it's what's harder to predict is what that person will be like or whose
Mhm.
side they will be on. That's hard to know. But it does seem like so there are a lot of books that are called the Republic. There's the famous uh uh Plato Republic, which I was gesticulating with earlier. But
Nice.
There's a Cicero Republic as well. Um, and Cicero says get this basically just quoting Aristotle. He says there's basically three forms of government. There's monarchy, aristocracy, democracy. They've all got their strengths and weaknesses, but the main weakness of all three as pure forms is that they're unstable. Monarchies
Mm.
tend to lead to aristocracies because the monarch tends to become weaker over generations, and so his court rises up and sort of takes power away from the king. Um, Aristocracies tend to devolve into democracies because the aristocrats are fighting for power with each other, and the aristocrat who offers power to the people wields democratic power over his aristocratic allies. But
Sure.
then, so aristocracy tends to devolve into democracy, and democracy tends to devolve into monarchy because things get just so out of hand that
Mm.
some strong individual who rises up and offers order will get a lot of public support, and then he becomes the new monarch. And according to Cicero and also Aristotle, like the problems with cycling through these three is worse than the fault of any single system of government. So if you have a republic, which is a blend of all three of these, where you try to find some
Yeah.
semblance of stability, that's the best of all. And it has its own sets of shortcomings and so forth. Um, but it does feel like the United States has lost its kind of monarchic uh or it's republic, I should say. Sorry. Freudian slip
No,
there.
you're good.
Lost its well, because Curtis Yarvin would say it needs to become more of a monarchy. So it actually has lost its monarchic element. It's basically become an aristocracy. Um,
So do you think, I guess, do you think that it's possible to like go back to like a republic once you lose that? Or or do you think do you think like these cycles of government always are occurring kind of like unconsciously too, and there's nothing we can really do about it almost? Or do you think there's like you can actually change those things, or like, because obviously in America we have a very unique system because we all have
yeah,
guns, and
yeah,
that's ultimately what gives us, the
that
people, I
does
think, in my opinion, the power and influence, because no other country has that.
it does change things.
So it's a
Well, they some countries have guns. Switzerland comes to mind, but they don't have the volume of guns or the particular gun culture that we have.
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
although of all people, I feel like France has really been putting us to shame in terms of proper revolutionary spirit. So who knows? Maybe
Everybody
guns.
talks shit on that, but
Yeah.
they're
Um,
rowdy. French are rowdy, man. I
but
get respect for them. They don't give a fuck.
but as far as like what the future holds and can we find our way out of it, it's kind of hard to say. I mean, we became a republic once, you know. Um,
True.
it probably was never the republic that you were taught we had in grade school, but that doesn't
Right. Or
mean
it
we
didn't
can.
last that long.
Yeah.
Only
Well,
lasted a couple years.
but it's, I mean, it's an open question whether the kind of republic, the kind of idealized moral republic that we teach grade schoolers is even desirable or possible, you know.
I don't think so.
Like,
Yeah.
yeah, so like what we had, you can say like the idealized notion of the republic that we were taught in 10th grade, like that was never a thing. But that doesn't mean that the, you know, revolution of 1775, 1776 wasn't something that was worthwhile. And what they eventually came up with in 1789, and one of Curtis Yarvin's favorite things to do is to point out whatever happened in that 10-year gap between
Mm.
1776 and 1789. You know, oh, George Washington wasn't the first president. Who the hell was John Hanson? Like,
Yeah.
what was that all about?
Wait, who are all these people? Yeah. I
Yeah.
never heard of these people before.
So
What's going on?
yeah, John Hanson was the real first president of America. It wasn't called the United States at the time, but the people often are unaware of that and the problems with the first
The first one. Yeah.
conf- confederation.
Because that
Um,
kind of that happened, like you said too. Like that was 10 years, and that's kind of like unspoken history. And you know, when I kind of answered my own question, we were asking like if we could go back because they saw a problem that they created and they came together and fixed it. So
all right.
um
So
I
it's
guess it's possible.
so is it possible for us now to kind of go back to that? Well, like first we have to figure out what that was. Like what
Yeah.
exactly did we have in 1789? Apparently the Ben Franklin thing wasn't what we thought it was. You
Yeah.
know, we had the First Amendment, except, you know, the people who passed the First Amendment into law also created the Alien and Sedition Act in like 1792 that made it illegal, or I'm probably got that year wrong, that made it illegal to mock the uniform of the armed forces, among other things. So what the hell was the First Amendment?
True.
There's a great book on this actually. It's called The Great Dissent. And it basically talks about how Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes rewrote the free speech clause of the First Amendment. What
Mm.
what the freedom of speech actually meant was a prohibition on prior restraint. You could be thrown in prison or fined for what you said. They just couldn't
And,
stop you in advance from saying it.
yeah, like I remember that too, like that in those early days you couldn't speak out against like you like religion too either,
Yeah.
like that was against the law too, like you couldn't. And that
Yeah.
was kind of ironic because that's supposedly what is told to us in history books and in school, that oh, you know, we came over here for, you know, to escape religious persecution. And it's like,
Yeah.
yeah, that may have occurred, but also people that came over here and came to power weren't like these. Like I dislike the idea that like these founding fathers were these like young poor rebels, you know, who rallied together to fight against this you know, this powerful kingdom. And it's like it's not really who they were or what they
No,
did, you know. But
they were the
it's yet
aristocrats
how
of
we
their age.
but
They're the
yeah, it's kind of
aristocrats of their
how
age.
we it's like how we sell this whole America and freedom and apple
Yeah.
pie, but then it's like so hypocritical because then we take, you know, going back to power and influence in Israel, we take like, you know, the people of Palestine and the people living in Gaza, and we say, what are they not freedom fighters? Do they not
Yeah.
deserve the same freedom and the same chance to exist that, you know, the Jewish people in Brooklyn have a right to the land in Israel? Do, you know, it's like do the people there not have that same right to that land?
Well,
And if so, you know, the laws of armed conflict say that uh they were allowed to resist,
Yeah.
by law.
We'll get to Israel in a second because I
Okay.
think this is gonna
Sorry.
be it's gonna be good. I'm excited to talk about it. Because I think you know a lot more about what's going on in Israel than I do. But I had one question I wanted to ask. Um, the Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes dissent on the First Amendment was in 1919.
Okay.
The changing the First Amendment, essentially. Universal women's suffrage, one of the big complaints about certain types of people about the original American Republic was that women couldn't vote. Women received universal suffrage in 1923. Do you know, or 22? Do you know when men received universal suffrage?
I do not.
I learned this from Karen Strong. It's in 1920. So
What does that exactly entail? Because, like, forgive my
all
ignorance, but I
men,
kind of.
all male, I think white male citizens could vote.
And
They could
before that, before
you
that,
could
that
not.
wasn't the case, right?
It was not. So it changes when people talk about a republic and they talk about a democratic republic. What was actually created in 1789 is very, very different than what people today imagine it was, based on our idealized notions of rights and so forth. And the rights question is another crazy one, the distinction between natural rights and civil rights, which probably happened in 1963, 64.
Yeah, because even
When the Civil
then,
Rights
like,
Act
look at,
passed.
we had the First Amendment, and then we just, that was, and freedom, and like the individuals, because people often talk like the slaves didn't have rights, the well,
Yeah.
like you said, women didn't really have rights. I'm sure
Well,
none
we
of the
did have
Native
rights.
Americans.
Voting was just not one of them.
Oh, okay, okay,
We
okay.
did have rights.
It wasn't the same as, like, not everybody had equal rights though. Like, rights, they all had rights, but it wasn't equal rights necessarily, right?
Well,
Would you say that?
depends on what you mean by rights, right? So this goes into the whole distinction between natural rights and civil rights. Equality is not a natural right. This is like very, very well understood in like philosophy and legal theory. What natural rights are, they're kind of hard to describe essentially, but they're descriptive facets of human dignity, essentially, that if you violate, not to get too mythological, but incur the wrath of the Furies. They're expressions of hubris. They're limitations on the state. You do not have the jurisdiction to go into someone's house. Your right to be secure in your personal estate and in your papers and stuff from undue searches and seizures, that's not protection from the weather. You don't have a right to the state to protect you from the rain or the wind. What you have is a limitation on the state to come into your house. There's actually an English judge who described the castle doctrine in those terms. He says the rain may come in, the wind may come in, but the King of England may not enter. Describing
And that was
without
like
due process.
the idea that your home is your home. You can't come
Right.
in,
You have
almost, pretty much.
sovereignty.
Yeah.
And so natural rights are basically limitations on the power of the state, whereas civil rights are entitlements from the state. And it's a very, very subtle conceptual shift, because you can actually reground most of the stated natural rights on civil rights, on a civil foundation. Say, oh, the state provides the right to life. Is a right to life the right to be protected from cancer? Is it a right to healthcare, for example, as some people might say? Or is it the right to not have my government kill me? Is it a limitation on my government's ability to kill me? A right to life in the positive sense is like to be protected from other kinds of things. kind of makes no sense on its face. But when you ground rights on a civil foundation, is these are the things you're entitled to from the state, it sort of retroactively changes all those other things. And this is why the First Amendment has become a lot less clear in many ways. The freedom of speech, the state can't stop you from saying something. That doesn't mean you have a right to say whatever you want in a church. For example, the church warden can be like, no, GTFO or whatever.
Yeah.
But and this is why what's shocking is for all of the gray area around the First Amendment, the Biden administration, if I can get specific, has very unusually managed to actually violate not just the contemporary Holmes sense of the First Amendment, but both original senses of the freedom of speech, which is the prohibition on prior restraint, which the executive branch was doing in collusion with big tech, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and so forth. So they did prior restraint. This is fairly well established now. And they were also, this is a little bit harder, would take more time to explain, but in other cases were guilty of compelled speech through similar mechanisms of the FBI working, basically coercing these big tech firms to say certain things. So compelled speech is another aspect of the freedom of speech. You cannot compel people to say things that are against their own conscience.
And then I guess that paints the broader picture going back to what you were saying about, the first positions of power. Does power ultimately corrupt them? Because look what this administration is doing. Look at rewind back to 9/11 and the Patriot Act, which a lot of people argue was one of the biggest violations of the First Amendment and our individual rights and sovereignty since fucking 1700s. So and we still don't even know. There's still so much of the Patriot Act that's clouded in redacted information that we don't know what they're capable of or what they're actually collecting or doing.
So much opacity. Yeah.
Yeah.
So but speaking of violating rights, you had brought up Israel and Palestine, and I believe there's probably no greater or more influential threat to the spirit and the culture of free inquiry and free dialogue and free expression in politics in the United States than our good friends over at the Anti-Defamation League. And now, as has been pointed out, the ADL is not like an agent of Israel. They are, of course, their own thing. They're an American group. But as Scott Adams has pointed out, it would be very easy for Israel to shut them down if they wanted to. If Israel came out and said, we don't endorse these people, we think they're racists. That was done.
Yeah. Well,
so they at least permit it. And there is at least nominally some kind of connection between an explicitly and overtly pro-Jewish group. I hope I'm not describing anything people aren't already aware of. And a prominently Jewish identity nation. So there seems to be some very strong connections between Israel and the United States, not all of which are particularly transparent or positive. But beyond the ADL, what can you tell us about those connections? Why is the whole Gaza Israel thing that's going on there a big deal for the United States, as far as you can tell?
From my understanding, I think, we have to go back and look at the history of the relationship between Israel and the United States. And that is also kind of cloudy, because there's a lot of influence with the British government and the crown and the people, then the modern state of Israel. And I would say, not to go back too deep, but we could probably start at, let's say, the Balfour Declaration.
Yes, tell me about that.
And
I literally heard the Balfour Declaration for the first time like 2 months ago. I'd never read it. I didn't even know what it was. So tell us. I'm sure some people who listen to this will be like, "What is the Balfour Declaration? What's that?"
I have a very, like, I'll tell everybody, and I excuse my ignorance in this because I still have a very limited understanding and of this. So I'll speak with what I know, and um, I'll try to explain it the best I can. And from what I gather is that the Balfour Declaration was ultimately sponsored by the Rothschilds, which is an interesting uh, thing, fact there. And ultimately, pretty much it was the promise of Zionism and promising that, the Jewish people had a right to the land of Israel, of modern Israel, of that being their land, and that basically that letter was, hey, we're supporting this. We're supporting uh, the modern state of Israel.
All
And
right.
then
I'm gonna interrupt you for a second because you brought up a word that you can't get 6 inches into the subject without hearing, and which seems to have a dozen different connotations, some of which are mutually exclusive, and that is
yeah,
Zionism. What
and
on
that's
earth is Zionism?
maybe you want to just read a definition, maybe, if you can pull it up on your computer, that would probably better define it than I could in my own words, without, and also, again, I don't want to offend anyone or, describe something the wrong way and
So
be labeled something.
Google's top result says Zionism is a movement for, originally, the reestablishment and now the development and protection of a Jewish nation in what is now Israel. It was established as a political organization in 1897 under Theodore Herzl and was later led by Chaim Weizmann. I'm sure I'm mispronouncing those. So it sounds like a movement for just Jewish nationalism. The claim of and advocacy for a Jewish ethnic state seems to
Yes.
be the center of it. Now I hear people talk about Zionism in much broader and global terms. There is I forget the word. There's a particular word for the Jewish doctrine of basically healing the world, and that often gets invoked. That I'm gonna have to look that up now.
Okay.
It
No, that ties
is
in really well.
Tikkun Olam, Tikkun Olam, and uh, this is basically interpreted as the desire for Israel to influence the entire world and to bring the world under Israeli influence in order to improve it. Now, there are some viral videos going around of rabbis that seem to say this, not just directly but kind of vulgarly. Now,
Yes.
the counter to that is there are other videos where rabbis say, no, no, no. Tikkun Olam is not even like a real rabbinical theological doctrine. It was like a placeholder doctrine created by some rabbis in like the 17th or 18th century in order to fill some explanatory gaps that were discovered. It was like a placeholder idea in order to explain some theological puzzles that they ran into, sort of in the way that physicists invented the idea of dark matter as a placeholder concept to fill in some equations they couldn't figure out. It's not
Okay.
actually an original or even a particularly serious component of modern, Hebrew theology. So I am
Yeah.
not a Hebrew scholar. I don't have a strong opinion on that one way or the other. But I'm just saying that, like, this is the sort of thing that I see get associated with Zionism, the word, far beyond just, and then people talk about communism and capitalism and other stuff, far beyond just the let's have a Jewish ethno state, essentially.
Yeah, it's I again, and going back to the influence and power and why, like, one of the things that I still have yet to kind of figure out is, like, I think I understand why, but why does the United States and Britain have such an investment with Israel? And bro science speaking and looking at it from a big blue arrow, like, okay, we need a footprint in the Middle East. That's the reason. We need a friend in the Middle East. We need an ally. We need and so,
Is that
like,
is that what it
is
is?
that that's what I'm saying. Like, I don't understand why there's such, like, a it's almost like you're, again, and I'm just coming from my own personal perspective, how I grew up and raised in, like, a evangelical Christian home, and pretty strict, and hearing words like, they're God's chosen people, and singing songs of, Father Abraham had many sons and you and I are one of them, and like, like, let's all get along, and it's
Yeah.
like, so I don't understand where, like, I have an idea, because I've talked to people and I've read and seen things of how this came about, and to be a part of, almost like, how did they intertwine with, like, American culture so much, like, to where we believe in that idea so much, to where if you question it, you're labeled, I heard it 3 times today that I'm an anti-Semite because I made a comment suggesting that, you know, uh, Mossad may have had something to do with 9/11. And, people are like, oh, that's anti-Semitic. And I'm like, well, I mean, there's facts and information there that
Yeah.
directly link the two. If you look it up, I'm not making that
So
up.
is it would it be anti-WASP to suggest that maybe the CIA had something to do with Vegas? Or is that
Right.
anti-white? I don't, because
Yeah,
is the CIA white? I don't know.
I don't know if I don't
I'm
know
not
who
making
they
that
are.
claim, by the way. I will
Yeah, yeah.
observe that the investigation of Vegas is opaque, but perhaps it was just one guy. I don't. Um,
That's a
but
whole nother, we'll have a whole nother
yeah,
podcast on
yeah,
that.
we'll get into. I had a podcast some months ago with a friend, Joe Peters, who I'm sure will correct me on some of the Zionism stuff as well. He's very very knowledgeable about this, and I want to talk with him about World War II at some point. But um, the 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 my understanding of all of these intelligence agencies, and it's not just Mossad, it's CIA and the Russian SVU or whatever it's called. That's probably something else. And the Chinese intelligence arm of the CCP, whatever they're called. Their purpose in all of these cases seems to be to destabilize the world. To keep, like if you're an MMA fighter and you're in the ring with an opponent, which is the situation with all of these powerful people vying for power and trying to maintain power a in a setting that is nothing but a competition for power. It's a fight. And part of your footwork is to retain stability, and part of your footwork is to try to throw off the other guy's stability. And maybe you're not even trying to knock him out. Maybe you just want to kind of keep him uncertain so that he won't hit you. But it seems like the purpose of all these intelligence agencies is to destabilize other parts of the world. It's why, like, people are like, why would England cut up Afghanistan's borders in such a way that would separate some tribes and group adverse tribes together? It's like, it's obvious why they would do
Yeah.
that. Why are
They
you
did the same thing
asking
in
why would they
Africa
do that?
too.
Why are you asking why they do? Of course. Now, my understanding of the history, so that's my take on what intelligence agencies do. And if they're not doing that, they're not doing their job well, according to the laws of power. Now, my understanding of the history of Jews in North Africa and the Middle East and Europe is that where Jews and Christians were together, things could get a little tense.
Yeah.
When Jews and Muslims were together, for some reason, it was largely fine. It seemed to be mostly fine. I remember hearing a sermon from an imam who
Okay.
was telling a story about there's this Muslim town, but there's the one Jewish man in the town, and he's got his Jewish family. And one day he has this good Muslim friend, and one day he comes to his Muslim friend. He says, "You know what? I think I would convert to Islam, but I love drinking." And the Muslim friend says, "Well, that's the solution to that is simple. Just convert to Islam and keep drinking." And the Jewish man says, "I can do that." And the Muslim says, "Of course you can do that." And Jewish man says, "Okay." And then he says the prayer 3 times and he converts. And the Muslim man says, "Wonderful. So happy to have you in our religious family. We'll throw a party tonight. We'll bring all our friends. And now you are a Muslim. So now you cannot drink. And if you do, we will kill you." And that is, first of all, I think it says Muslims can have an absolutely wicked sense of humor. But two, that is only the kind of joke you make about people that you're on kind of friendly terms with. That is a like breaking your
True.
buddy's balls kind of joke, you know.
Yeah.
And
Agreed.
the history of Jews in Muslim lands is way more peaceful than either Christian and Muslims getting along or Christians and Jews getting along. So it seems to me like the creation of Israel was profoundly destabilizing and perhaps not in the best interests of the Jews in that area. Although, who's to say, given the fate of the Jews in Europe? Like, it is rumored that Hitler was not very fond of the Jews. But he was, sorry, I should not be that deadpan about that. But my understanding was that Hitler was one of the early advocates for the creation of a Jewish state in the Middle East. As the way Curtis Yarvin, I believe it was Curtis Yarvin put it, is the final solution was not the first solution.
Yeah, I think I read something similar along those lines that, Hitler obviously had some, I don't know why, but that's a whole nother story that I don't know enough about to speak on it intelligently. But for whatever reasons, he did what he did,
Mhm.
and like from what I understand, is his first, like you said, his first solution was to, like, even the United States, like, they offered to send thousands to, like, I think, like, I forget how many thousand in the United States, and we denied them at one point.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that's like, again, and I just, that makes that's an interesting idea about the destabilization, because I guess I never really thought about it from that kind of perspective, and that idea of intelligence and the purpose of them. I guess then I was reading something else, and it was a theologian who was talking about, and this is going to be very controversial as well, is the the majority of European Jews were not connected with DNA to the Canaanites of Israel.
Hmm.
And so if that was true, then that would kind of, I don't know if it would, like, would that uncreate Zionism in a way?
Well,
Because if you can't define a group of people, then how can you define their place, their rightful place? Like if I told you
right,
that I was Irish and like I'm six, like from what I understand of my background, I'm mostly Irish. Would I say, hey, because my family, great parents owned this village here and I was a lord 200 years ago, does that mean that I now should inherit that? And, if I tried to go to Ireland and do that, they'd fucking tell me to kick rocks, they'd be
right.
like,
Well,
you're high.
this brings us back perhaps to the Italian school of political science and the political formula, because what it sounds like Zionism is a political formula. It is a magic spell designed to justify the creation of a Jewish state. And by the way, like, why American and English intelligence agencies would support such a thing is not to say is not that's not necessarily going to be the same reason why um, Jews and now we would call them Israelis would support such a thing. They might say, like, no, we want a homeland for ourselves, and we would say, well, we want them to have a homeland because it screws up that whole region, which helps our economy. But those two things can both be true. Like, we can have very what we would call Machiavellian reasons to support something that is advanced for completely sincere reasons, which is not to say that they were or were not sincere. I don't know, but like, I just wanted to put that out there. It looks like a understanding Zionism in terms of, is it properly theologically and genetically justified? That's a logical point, but these political formulas are not logical assertions.
And like you,
They're,
because they're not necessarily, because
yeah,
they're amoral too, right? So
exactly.
it's not even like a moral thing. And again, I'm not saying this has to do with why the Israeli army so indiscriminately is killing, civilians. Like there's what they're saying that like over 30,000 Palestinians, people of Gaza, have been killed, and most of them women and children. It's like, how can you claim that you want progress and you want this state and you want to have a future and at the same time do that? Because like you said too, that just seems to me very destabilizing, because you didn't just kill 30,000 people, you created 200,000 martyrs, and even more
Right.
freedom fighters who are going to now have a cause to fight you for the next 200 years.
Well, because this goes into the Palestinian, um, and
Because they're
there's
not
something,
innocent either.
yeah. There's some,
Everybody's guilty of everybody. They all have blood on their hands, of course, but
right. Well,
uh,
and their political formula is like, no political formula is objectively correct. Like, and this is what people get wrong when they go around talking about how, like, America and Canada were like built on stolen land or whatever. It's like they're making an appeal to some moral foundation for a political formula that is just not how those work. Now, it can be an effective kind of magical spell to delegitimize a formula. You can use morality to erode a political formula, certainly,
okay,
but that itself
yeah,
is not moral, because they don't have some kind of objectively moral counter offer. The Amerindians, whose land was conquered, or taken in bad treaties or stuff, was itself taken by those Amerindians in similar manners of conquest and so forth. There's actually a funny line of dialogue at the beginning of The Last of the Mohicans, the book, where Natty Bumppo and his friend are having this friendly argument. You know, the white guy says, or the Lakota says to the white guys, "Listen, you stole our land from us," and the white guy says, "Yeah, you did the same thing to the people who were there before you." And the Lakota's response was, "Yes, but we did it directly with violence. You did it with alcohol, which is
And
weaker."
whiskey, yeah, with whiskey,
which
yeah.
is weaker. And
Mhm.
it's a funny rejoinder that's kind of hard to like, there was a little bit of that going on. um
But it
but
seems to me like,
but the pride taken in conquering it directly with violence is very counter to the people who try to appeal to make the whole stolen land argument, because conquering land is not stealing it any is not less stealing than winning it by craft. It's
yeah.
just a different technique, and we can come up with moral sounding political formulas for whatever side wins.
And that's kind of like, obviously I try to look at everything, from a open, as much of an open mind as I can, and I try to be empathetic to people. And there's so much history in all of these things and interwoven into the fabric of our country and everything else. And bloodshed, unfortunately, has been a part of that. And it's like, yeah, if you can pick apart anything that humans did from a moral standpoint and say, what they did to them was wrong. Like, we've been doing that since, no matter what story you believe, even if you believe the historical piece of the Bible and that Cain and Abel, like, what did they first do? They killed each other for what? For jealousy. Why? Like, for a sacrifice to their God? Like, that's, so you're saying the first civilizations, the first thousands of years of men were fighting over the same things that we're fighting over today.
Yeah.
So
Oh,
it's like,
exactly. Yeah. And having
what
the
is,
same
what,
arguments,
yeah,
with Thrasymachus 2300 years ago saying, "Oh, you're just appealing to morality because you're weak, because you don't have power."
that's, I remember I read that. I think that's in Nietzsche's Will to Power, right?
This is the
Speak about that.
book one of Plato's Republic. Nietzsche, of course, talks about this in Will to Power, which is actually one of the books of his I haven't actually read all the way
I
through.
think I might read like pieces of it. I don't think I've read
I've
the whole
read The
thing
Birth of
through.
Tragedy like a dozen times. I've read The Antichrist like 6 or 8 times. I've read The Genealogy of Morals a couple times. He's got some absolute bangers. My favorite is probably the Joyful Wisdom, sometimes translated very unfortunately as The Gay Science, but it's German.
The
So
gay science, yeah,
what are you
yeah,
gonna do?
yeah.
Fantastic book though. And he covers a lot of this ground, but Nietzsche was talking about this stuff in the 1880s, 1890s, and he does it very well. But it is fascinating to see the same sorts of points being brought up in 400 BC, in the tail end of classical Greece. And we're it
Yeah, like,
like you said, it's the same conflicts, the same arguments. It just with little slightly different contexts and different characters involved.
yeah, I think it's, yeah, it's going back to, the whole thing with, Israel and Palestine and that struggle there. And, like you said, political solutions, going back to that too. Like, I keep on hearing that, there's this two-state solution there. And I just, like, I don't see how anyone in the IDF was like, hey, we're going to lead this operation, we'll call it a military operation against Gaza, and that's going to help us. Like, we're going to kill 30,000 people and bomb them for relentlessly and starve them, and hey, this is going to be good. So I can't help to think, going back to what you said repeatedly about, you know, intelligence agencies destabilizing, because I just can't, eh, like, I try to see the glass half full with that, but I just don't see anything positive, like besides Israel getting their way and getting the land they want. I don't see
Right.
anything positive happen from that.
Well, there's a I I think, and this is just pure speculation, but there is a kind of democratic power at work in any society, even in the most totalitarian dictatorships. There's still democratic power.
Okay.
Even if you don't have a vote, there's like a force latent in the population, which is why even harsh monarchies feared slave and peasant revolts. You had to you had to do some things to prevent that at the very least. And in Israel, if there is an atrocity like October 7th, um, if the state does not respond in some sufficiently destructive manner, if they don't bring satisfaction to the wronged parties so that they feel that the blood price has been paid, then they will begin to lose legitimacy. That would be my guess. So
Kind of like,
there has to be a mission of vengeance, essentially. And you cannot, part of the legitimacy thing is you can't frame it that way because vengeance is not smiled upon in our current
well,
moral climate. It's immoral, we might say.
well, that's
But it's still
that's
a psychological necessity.
that's like, I think I understand that. I guess my problem is like, you yeah, like, how do you even, like, how do you sleep with that? Like, I don't understand how that can be, like, accepted, like, like
I
in
like
those
the
in
question. I like the question, how do you sleep with that? Because we often talk about not sleeping well in moral terms. How can you sleep with yourself if um you don't do this? And the initial desired answer is like, well, I don't sleep with myself. I sleep with someone. Anyways, there's a documentary that I want to do its own podcast on. Fantastic documentary called Dead Birds by Robert
Okay.
Gardner. He's an anthropologist who goes to live with an Aboriginal people in Papua New Guinea. And the
Okay.
entire documentary is about primarily about one man. I forget his name, but he's living through a blood feud. He participated in a raid where they killed another man in another village, and a great source of pride and magical power and good luck for their village. But if one of their members of one of their villagers are killed, which happens later on in the film, a boy is killed. It's like an 8-year-old boy caught out drinking water by himself. The raiders killed him. His ghost will haunt the village and bring bad luck until it is avenged. And it is very dangerous to go walking out at night where the ghosts are around. So the spirits of the unavenged dead can prevent your sleep at a much deeper primordial psychological part of our brain than our much more sort of prefrontal cortex abstract notions of morality can. It's a morality is very much a later addition, but the
You're bringing
need,
like a metaphysical
well, yeah,
element to it
the need for
almost.
vengeance was personified by the Greeks as the Furies, were these like grotesque, gnarled, dark-skinned old women who were
Okay.
older than the gods themselves.
Like the
And
oracles almost, am I on point with that, or is that different?
no,
Greek,
they're
that's completely different.
they're like godlike beings. They're
Okay.
older than Zeus, older than
Okay.
um Poseidon, older than Apollo, older than the gods. Um and they embody the spirit of revenge. And you know, I don't want to get too like Jungian or Campbellian or Petersonian about it, but I don't think it's necessary to believe in these entities literally in the way that a monotheist is kind of like required to believe in their
Yeah.
deity literally. But the desire to depict these entities and the power that these depictions have over the consciousness of the people that they were presented to, I think conveys something about our own sense of justice and revenge. And it's actually in Nietzsche's Tarantulas, um, where he equates, he says, yeah, distrust those with a strong instinct for revenge and for justice. The bloodhound and the hangman look out of their visage.
Hmm.
He says they're of a low sort and stock. He's that's some 19th century writing right there.
He's talking against that, right? Like he's
Yes,
talking against the idea of avenging someone or of revenge, right?
I
That he doesn't believe that's moral, or he thinks he doesn't have any like is or am I way off? Because I don't remember. I
yes,
didn't
no,
think I
he's
read that.
very much against revenge. I want to actually pull it up and read it
Okay.
because it's worth, it's not very long, and it's also but it's also hard to find.
The mustache the mustaches demand it, so
Yeah,
it must be done.
yeah. Nietzsche on the tarantulas. Um, Behold, this is the hole of the tarantula. Do you want to see the tarantula itself? Here hangs its web. Touch it, that it trembles. There it comes willingly. Welcome, tarantula. Your triangle and symbol sits black on your back. And I also know what sits in your soul. Revenge sits in your soul. Wherever you bite, black scabs grow. Your poison makes the soul whirl with revenge. Thus I speak to you in parable, you who make souls whirl, you preachers of equality. To me you are tarantulas, and secretly vengeful. But I shall bring your secrets to the light. Therefore I laugh in your faces with my laughter of the heights. Therefore I tear at your webs, that your rage may lure you out of your lie holes, and your revenge may leap out from behind your word, justice. And this is the key line right here. For that a man be delivered from revenge, that is for me the bridge to the highest hope and a rainbow after long storms. The tarantulas,
I
of
like that.
course, would have it otherwise. And then it goes on. I it's like I said before, it's such a worthwhile read. But the
I'm gonna
equation,
buy it. I'm gonna buy it tonight.
it's thus speaks Zarathustra. But the equation of revenge with justice, I think, is true. And
That you
Curtis,
it is justice. Are you saying that you do
yes,
think it's a type of okay?
I believe justice is vengeance, essentially. And
Okay.
I mean, Curtis Yarvin says this about politics and democracy. He says, um, you know, if you enter a work conference and someone says, this is a great concept you've got going here, but I really think we should uh, politicize it. I really think we should make this concept and how we address it and how we engage with it. We should make it more political. You can bet all your life savings that 95% of the people in that room are going to be like, absolutely not. That sounds like a horrible idea. No one wants to politicize things that are not political. Like that's terrible. Scenario two, same conference, same idea, same person gets up, but instead of saying they want to politicize it, they said, I think we should democratize this process. It's exactly the same thing. It's actually exactly the same semantically, but the connotation is very different. And you'll actually get a lot of people probably saying, yeah, democratizing it, that sounds like a good idea. It's exactly the same thing as politicizing it. Um, I think justice and
Because
revenge,
you're appealing necessarily like to the people, right? Either way, right?
right?
You're appealing to the want of the crowd or the mob or whoever.
Exactly. And I think justice and revenge can be thought of the same way. I mean, Nietzsche talks about your word justice. Um, it's just a hiding place for revenge. Um, so when people talk about when you hear certain groups say something like "no justice, no peace," um, it sort of that actually works rhetorically. It
Mhm.
has a kind of thumotic power to it. You're like, yeah, I don't want to be peaceful in an unjust society. It's tapping into that spirit of revenge, the spirit of what, because justice and revenge are related in that way. And I think when Nietzsche talks about overcoming your need for revenge, he is also at the same time talking about overcoming the magical power that the word justice has over us too.
I like that. That's and that's shit, man. That's the human, that's the, or I should say more or less the male, ego and problem today. We all
Mhm.
think we deserve justice, and we all think we deserve vengeance, and that our vengeance is just and righteous.
Yeah.
And it's like, at what point, like you said, I think I agree with Nietzsche in that idea that letting that go ultimately is the ultimate like path to freedom, to self freedom, because
To
you're,
personal power, even perhaps.
yeah, you're taking away that control that that person had over you because of that, and you're saying no. Like, it's ultimately forgiveness, if you think about it. Like, what is forgiveness? I had a preacher say one time, and I still love this. He's like, forgiveness is when you deserve justice, you deserve vengeance, but you relinquish it. And I was like, that's powerful. Like that makes
Yeah.
sense. Like, when you deserve, when justice is deserving, but instead you say no, I'm gonna forgive you for it.
Yeah.
Um,
There's no one
that's,
more.
and I think that's power. Like that, to
Yeah.
me, that's more powerful than enacting revenge, personally.
You know who's the
Um,
most forgiving man then is John Hamm in the elevator. There's that scene from Mad Men where the underling looks at I forget the protagonist's name, John Hamm's character. He says, "You know what? I pity you." And John Hamm looks at him and he says, "I don't think of you at all," and walks out. And it's like not even deigning um to respond to these things. Because I mean, this fits in with one of Nietzsche's more often quoted lines, which is, um, beware fighting monsters lest you become a monster.
yeah.
Um, and
Or
the
what's that? Didn't Young say, don't stare too long into the abyss, or something like what, or
that's
something like that
that's
about
actually
that?
the second part of the
The
Nietzsche
same.
quote. I
Oh, okay.
don't I don't doubt and when you stare too long into the abyss also stares back at you. Um
Yeah.
I have no doubt Jung also said that because
I think
Jung
he said
read a
something
fair bit
like
of Nietzsche.
similar to that. Yeah, something along those
Probably.
lines.
But
Yeah.
I mean I think there's a kind of psychological trap that people can fall into. And it seems to be particularly potent with Israel at the moment, and
What
will
about,
probably continue to be, where you look at forces with great influence and say they are driving my life, basically. Like Israel's seems to have a tremendous amount of influence in the United States in American politics. Um, I did a Wikipedia search a year or two ago, just the number of Holocaust museums in existence. Um, there's a Holocaust museum in Greenland. There's a Holocaust museum in Japan. Oh, wait, actually, that might not be true. I don't know. There are Holocaust museums in all kinds of places where that have no business hosting Holocaust museums. What is the purpose of that? Why do we have Holocaust museums in the United States at all? That
we don't have
having the
we don't have we don't have Holdemore museums.
No, we don't. We don't have up until last time I checked, the state of Israel still did not officially acknowledge the Armenian genocide of 1917 or whenever that was. I should know my dates better. I don't.
That's so
Serge Tankian would be very upset with me. Uh,
smart.
but it is what it is. We can't pay attention to all of these things, which is kind of the point of the Holocaust Museum, to get you to bear this in mind, because it feels like a great part of the power of the political formula of Zionism is the Holocaust. And so they have to push these Holocaust museums all over the world because their political theory is built upon it. So, of course, they're going to spread that. And if it's in the United States' interest to keep the state of Israel alive for its own interests, then it would make sense that they would go along with that, I suppose. But none of that obliges us to, cast our eyes repeatedly in their direction. And like you can see the natural. Curtis Yarvin talks about the importance of killing your thumos. And part of me still hates that. When I first heard it, I completely hated it. But the more I've thought about it, the more I'm like, I at least see where he's coming from, because our thumos is the center of our own sense of justice and therefore our own desire for revenge. And so when we see, some nation committing atrocities, or we are told some nations committing atrocities, I take it as an assumption that 95% of atrocity reports in a war are false. Some of them aren't, I'm sure, but I assume most of them are false. I assume most of them are propaganda. No one was beheading babies in a hospital.
Yeah.
That did not happen. Did it at one point happen somewhere at some point? Doubtless, I'm sure.
Maybe.
But you can bet your life savings that didn't happen 9 times out of 10. Don't bet your life savings. Anyways, like the part of us that is that like fiery young man, the like, I want to join the military at 18. Like that part of you seems very easy to guide and to lead around with blinders on, by political formulas and by propaganda. It's just very easy to tap into these emotions. There's that line from Shooter where Mark Wahlberg's character says, they played the Patriot card on me. And talking about how they manipulated him into this ridiculous assassination plot scheme, double blind thing. And he said, I'm not proud of it, but I'm not ashamed of it either. And I feel like that captures it just right. Like it's that it's sad when someone doesn't have any thumos left at all. But it's something to keep an eye on, because it can get you fired up about like
Could save your life.
Yeah. Like if you are not Jewish or ethnically Arab and you're an American and you have really strong feelings about the Israel-Palestine conflict, like it's worth asking why. Like if you're ethnically Jewish and you have family in Israel, totally makes sense. If you are ethnically Arab and you have family that lives in, occupied Palestine, totally get it. It makes sense to have strong feelings about it. If you're a WASP or another non-Jewish, non-Arab American who has really strong feelings about that, why? Why do you care about Ukraine? Why do you care? Why do you care about Ukraine and not care about Sudan? Or not care about the situation in North Korea or what, whatever atrocity is going on
Yeah.
in the world.
Pick one. Pick yours.
Right. And like the, freedom from that desire for revenge seems to be a path out of the corrupting draw of political power and influence, and it like leaves you free to pursue personal power and and more, and maybe this is the most important thing, more like mental uh control over your own mind.
Mm.
Because at the end of the day, and I'm borrowing this from Matthew Crawford, I'm not sure if there's a difference between controlling your mind and controlling your attention.
I would say it's one and the same, probably.
Yeah. Um, and so it's which is not to say we shouldn't pay attention to politics at all and become,
Yeah.
idiots in the Greek sense,
Yeah.
completely detached
Yeah.
private people. Um, it makes sense to pay attention to politics in the way that it makes sense to watch the weather. You want to know what's happening around you so you can plan accordingly. I moved my family out of Western Washington because I was watching the weather. Um, but and there's a kind of power, personal power, meaningful personal power that comes from knowing what's going on in your environment. But the um, I mean, the propaganda being pushed by Israel as well as by the United States is like quite astonishing in its ability to just capture people. Um,
I I have one. I want to get this quick question before we run out of time, but it involves, what do you think? So one of my favorite lines by Malcolm X was, he said, "Freedom can never be safeguarded peacefully." So how would you say freedom and power and influence kind of intermingle with the current situation in Palestine and Israel? Like, the people, like, does, like, going back to what I said before about, like, people have, we talked about rights in the very beginning of this, like, that is very, we very, everyone has a different view on what rights are and who has rights to what, and
yeah.
and freedom, and it's like, yeah, that's, what do you think about that? I know that's
Well,
kind of a broad question.
it's complicated. Let me respond sort of obliquely.
Okay.
Um, on October 8th, or maybe October 9th, like a few days after the attack on October 7th, one of my favorite commentators, Scott Adams, was describing a video scene where um, Hamas fighters, I'm not going to call them terrorists, it's an attack, it's a military attack, uh, were coming into civilian homes and they were just gunning people down. They came into one home where one man and his family had a gun. And so the man he's describing this video where it shows the man helps his family out the window onto the roof of an adjacent building. He gets them all out and he's the last one, but he stays inside. And you see the flashes of gunfire in there. And maybe he killed a Palestinian, maybe he didn't. But you see him kind of fall out the window. And the last movement of him was the gun falling out of his hand. Now, and it visually showed, he died, but he saved his family. He protected his family. He gave them time to get out. And that security and that power was, um, you know, secured at the end of a gun. Now, Scott is a trained hypnotist. I am 80% sure he made up that story and that video does not exist. Just a guess. But and I'm guessing that because of the very, very visual way that he described it. He always talks about visual persuasion and visual. And as I was describing it, was I painting a picture in your head? Could you
Mhm.
imagine that scene in your head as I was describing it? And it made it feel real. And it made that last moment of the gun dropping out of the man's hands, the last thing, feel very symbolic, didn't it?
Hmm.
And that was what he was trying to do. Um, so it's a kind of very powerful rhetorical manipulation that causes you to visualize that and have a certain feeling about it. Um, you know, whether that video exists or not, I happen to believe it's true. Because at the end of the day, the government isn't there to keep you safe. It might keep you safe if it believes it's in its own interests to keep you safe.
Keep it safe. Yeah.
But if not, then not. It's not on them at the end of the day. Um, you
Yeah. Like the
you have
police
to look out for
proved
yourself.
that when, what was
In
that
Uvalde,
case? Police-
well,
Yeah.
in Uvalde
Where,
as well.
well,
But there
even
are a number
before
of
that,
cases.
they had a, yeah, there was a number of cases where, like, the judge, a federal judge said, I forget the name of the case, who versus who, but it basically said that,
The
you
police don't
know,
have a
law,
duty to protect. Yeah.
yeah,
Um,
yeah. And it's like the same thing, the government, we, like you were talking, I think you were talking about this before, you might have been, or somebody else. It's like, the government gives us liberties. That's why I said in my story the other day, like, there's a difference between liberty and freedom that I don't think a lot of people understand. Like, liberties is granted by the government. Freedom could be granted necessarily by
that's a very
it's
civil
innate.
that's a very
Yeah,
civil rights idea that liberty is
yeah,
granted by the natural rights view is that liberty exists and the government either respects and protects liberty or it violates it. Yeah. Um, there is. I was having a very interesting conversation with Jack a couple of days ago, Jack Donovan, on the Pater podcast about freedom and the trade-off between freedom and connection. He said at one point, like, because I have dogs, I am not free, or at least I'm less free. I can't just abandon everything and move to France. I have people who depend on me. But at the
yeah,
same time, like, if I was purely free, I would want dogs because I like dogs. So there's
yeah.
this trade-off between, and the state isn't the only thing that does this. The the I mean, you're married with kids. Your wife wants certain things, your kids want certain things that sort of infringe upon your
Yeah, I have the same thing.
absolute
I
freedom.
have a
And
bunch of dogs, and I can't. Yeah, I have a bunch of dogs too, and I can't just get up and fucking,
right,
grab my kids and family and just bounce whenever I want
you
to.
can't you
I have
can't
to responsible.
exactly with dogs, you can't
Yeah,
exactly enjoy the 4th of July the way you might otherwise. Um, you know,
I think
uh,
people get dependent on the government, and they think the government owes them their liberty or their freedom. You know what I mean? Like, they expect the government to fight for that. And I think that's the more important, view
right.
from Malcolm, and that concept of, no, if you want individual liberties and freedoms, then you have to fight for them,
Yeah.
and you have to
Well,
create them.
because the people that the government cares about and the people that the government will protect, because there absolutely are people the government will protect at all costs with all of its power.
ISIS is never, yeah,
Well, it's the people who bring the government more power. The government will protect the people who give the government power. The way that CGP Grey explained it, he says farming subsidies have nothing to do with notions of like justice or economic benefits from agriculture or anything like that. It has everything to do with, are farmers a powerful enough voting bloc that, a political party uh, requires their support in order to stay in power. If so, you will get farming subsidies. If not, then not. And but the cost is some investment in power. And you find and this is Socrates' argument against Thrasymachus. Thrasymachus says everyone wants to be a tyrant. And Socrates' counter ultimately is there's no one more pitiable, no one we should feel sadder for, and no one uh, who we should envy less than a political leader. because they
Mhm.
are in fact the most constrained. Biden might be the most constrained man in all of history for a
Mhm.
number of different reasons. Um,
Yeah.
like between the situation with his son, like who knows just how many people have dirt on him. Um, he's probably like we think David Cameron had it bad, having the revelation of him fucking the pig head or whatever it was. I mean, but it seems like all these political people go through these gangland initiation rituals that may or may not involve killing someone, that are just about people getting dirt on you. There's just like a bunch of people with Damoclesian swords over each other's heads, and it sounds stressful and horrible. And it's only the weird sociopathic addiction to power that keeps them wanting to stay, or once they're in, they can't get out. They're stuck. Um,
Mm.
it's like the I don't know if what you have there is power. You certainly have influence. You're now a player in this weird game, but
Mhm.
the kind of freedom that maybe Malcolm Gladwell or Gladwell Malcolm X talking about. Malcolm Gladwell is interested in something else entirely.
Yeah.
That Malcolm X is talking about. I think he's talking about the more personal kind of
Yeah.
freedom, which of course requires certain implements. If you want to survive against a bear or against muggers, it helps to be armed. If you want to
Yeah.
get somewhere, it helps to have a car. Um, Sometimes, if you want to survive in a political climate, it does take a degree of political influence. You just have to be careful of not getting of maintaining a degree of perspective, perhaps, and not getting
Yeah.
drawn in too far. But
Yeah.
that's
That's
my feeling of Malcolm X. Malcolm X strikes me as a very, I'm not familiar with a ton of his work. Um,
mhm.
but he strikes me from what I've heard from him as a very high agency kind of guy. And he seems like he cares about personal agency and not just political recognition.
Yeah. I mean, I would say he very much like that was, his goal. I mean, again, given his time frame and, during the civil rights movement and all of that, like he obviously he needed to like a lot of people dislike him because they're, oh, he was this or he was that, and even, oh, he was a communist or whatever. Like I think I understand that, and I think it was kind of a necessity for him to be that way, like, and to be that, like, in your face, like, aggressive. No, like, we need to demand our rights and our freedoms, and if we don't do that, then the government's not going to give them to us, because ultimately, like you said, the government's going to protect the people that empower them. And frankly, you know
Yeah.
the government didn't need that, and now they do. And now we see how that attitude it has changed, and how that language has changed,
Yeah.
so.
Rights are very metaphysically tricky. I have mixed feelings about I don't really know where I stand on whether rights exist or not. Um,
Mm,
because it feels like if they only exist because we assert them, then they don't exist when we don't assert them, which means they aren't rights. They're just demands. They're just requests. But if you take a step back and think at like a broader level of historical patterns of like what do people demand as a feature of our human nature, you could get something that is maybe at an abstract level, um, above just an individual desire, that is meaningful as a request. But even there, we only observe it because some people in the past said, well, I'm going to take this. We
yeah.
the right of revenge exists because people would say, damn the consequences, I'm going to take revenge. Which is not to say that revenge is desirable. Well, again, we're being I feel like that's the theme of this show, is like what happens when you observe things descriptively and amorally. And it says nothing about the desirability of the, Machiavellian political world. Perhaps
Yeah.
the contrary. Perhaps looking at it objectively gives you a clear view of why maybe it's not, that kind of influence isn't really the power that you want. And maybe the reason why Israel in particular seems to have put so much effort into exerting so much influence over so much of the world, and over the Western world in particular, is because it's trapped from, in its very existence, from the Balfour Declaration, in this
Mm,
crazy game of political machinations, and like, because it's being challenged, it has to exert all this influence just to survive.
mm. That makes a lot more sense, like when you look at it
Yeah.
that way.
And that's not even to say that its survival is desirable or not desirable. I remain agnostic, and uh, you know uh, somewhat indifferent to that whole thing.
Yeah.
But I understand why they would want to fight to survive, and
Yeah.
and good luck to them, I guess. And the other side is going to fight as hard as they can too, because their land was taken from them. It's a very uh interesting game, but it just makes me think of the of the lone Jewish man in the Arab town who was otherwise getting along with his Muslim friends, until this power game got involved and ruined it. It's
Mhm.
it's a it, I don't know if that's true or not, but it's like it seems to be a more descriptive story, from my understanding of that region, than the story that the Daily Wire and the ADL are pushing today.
Yeah, there's again, it's one of those things that it's like there's so much to unpack in that, and there's so much history in that area, and arguably where time began. And then you have all the Abrahamic religions that come from there. So it's like it's this just soup of just it's complicated as hell, and it's like we're all trying to
Yeah.
understand it. And at least I am, like I don't really like, I'm passionate about people not being killed in war, and I'm passionate about, you know, are my children, not having to worry about going to fight and die for another country in 10 years. And, so, going back to what you said too about like, okay, if I'm a white dude in America, which I am a white dude in America, what does the people of Israel and of Gaza have to do with me? And it's,
Right.
I guess, I don't have to answer that question, but I just feel like that's doing, taking part in the wars that I have been and having. I feel like it's a moral obligation in my own way to speak out against those things. So
Yeah.
I, in my own way, I hope we don't have to repeat them, but will
Yeah.
I make a difference in anything that I say? I don't know.
Yeah.
I
You
guess.
all history seems to imply that young men will always do this. Just the
Yeah.
tragedy of it all. But we can at least, perhaps our goal can be to at least prime them to see this, so that once they feel like they've been used in this way, and left with like alopecia or some weird radio related radiation cancer, or broken lower vertebrae, or a few TBIs or whatever,
PTSD. Yeah.
they'll at least have some frame of reference for understanding what happened to them. And like,
Yeah.
because you can't convince people out of that. You couldn't have convinced me out of it when I was
Yeah.
18. I don't know if it could have
Same.
convinced you, but like, there
No.
is a sense of, for lack of a better word, closure, to understand, okay, here's what it was that got me. You can have that moment of what's the word? That anagnorisis, that moment of recognition that the tragic hero recognizes how he got to the reversal of fortune that he underwent. He's like, oh, okay, I see why this had to happen to me. Got it. And the tragedy can be edifying and educational sounds almost too degrading. It's above educational. It's like spiritually taking you to a higher level of that sounds grandiose. You
No,
know
you
what
know
I'm
what?
trying to
The
say
perfect.
though.
You, I read this book after a friend recommended the Hagakure. If excuse me if
Yes.
I'm butchering that, but
No, you're not.
you know, and that I guess that's kind of my path. The way for me is I write poetry and I speak out against war and I try to you know spread that. I guess it's the yin to my yang. Like
Yeah.
I did that and now I'm trying to you know fulfill myself with what I feel is right. And, that may be wrong to somebody else and I may be called names and ridiculed and online, but to me, it's self-fulfilling and I find peace in that. So,
Yeah.
it is what it is.
Yeah. And here's to hoping if at least one guy reads that and says, you know what, maybe I won't go off and die for nothing and waste this for people who are addicted to weird influence games in a crazy world of political power they can't escape anyways. Maybe I don't need to die for that. Maybe I can
Yeah.
I'll try to try not to go too long, guys. I just got eyeballs from the wife, but there was a story that Curtis Yarvin tells of Freda Utley, and I think it's like it's an important story. Freda Utley was a communist writer
Okay.
in the 1920s, 1930s, true believer, married a Russian activist, um, but went to Russia, and when he was in Russia, he was taken in by the police and sent to the gulags. Just disappeared.
Well,
And when Freda Utley returned to the United States, she went to all of her communist friends, being like, "Please help me. There's been a mistake. My husband's been like taken. This is wrong." And they said, "Who are you? What is this anti-Soviet activist that is talking to me? I have never met you before, like Peter with Jesus." And she is just baffled and heartbroken at having all of her close friends stab her in the back like that, uniformly. And so she went to her friend Edith Hamilton, the mythologist, and said, "Why is this happening to me?" And Edith Hamilton's response was, "Well, you really shouldn't think that the spiritual rewards of telling the truth will come alongside with the material success of this world. You really shouldn't expect that." And so
it's fucking deep.
it's a it's a dangerous game to get into this stuff, to get into the world of power and politics. And the conclusion of Plato's Republic, which is meant for a young man, it's written for Plato's brother Glaucon, who is looking to get into politics. He concludes with a story of a man who descends into the underworld. He's believed to be dead on the battlefield, is set on a pyre, but he has a vision of going into the underworld. And he sees Odysseus in the underworld, who, after all of his travels and wars and stuff, is in the underworld, and he gets to choose a new body. And the body that Odysseus chooses is the life of a private man, the life of a nobody, someone that is not in the public eye. And that's the life that he chooses. It's actually the life he was stuck with, but the life he claims he would have chosen anyways. And
Mm.
it gives this sense that perhaps the path of real power is actually not in trying to influence people, either in politics or in being an influencer, in the social media sense, or in the as a communist in the 1930s, or what have you.
No, I like that. I like that a lot because again, it's I think what was it? There was some who was it? Something about the quote of something along the lines of there's nothing quite powerful like owning yourself, and like
Yeah.
that's and like going back to power, that's the power. If we can have any power, if we can just have power over our own emotions and our own lives, and that in itself is probably the hardest power to achieve, is the power over oneself. And so I think this conversation was a great reminder to you know maintain that path of
Hmm.
power and influence over myself and the
Yeah,
things that I can control. And if I help people along the way, cool. If not, I can't give them power by reacting to it.
exactly. And follow the path of the private man, and perhaps not the path of Israel. I feel, looking at Israel, I feel very much like, you know, Plato's Socrates contemplating the dictator or the ruler. No one seems less free than Israel.
Yeah.
They seem so intensely constrained. And not just their citizenry. I mean, even their politicians. Profoundly unenviable. At least as far as I can tell. Maybe I'm wrong, but it's as far as I can see. So, anyways, Dan, thanks so much for coming on and chatting.
Chris,
It's
thank you.
fantastic to hear your journey through the military and into all these this kinds of subjects. It's fascinating to get um, other perspectives on this, especially from people who've actually been over in kind of that general region. So,
Dude,
um,
it's awesome. You continue to teach me and inspire me in many ways, and I am grateful for this opportunity. And I hope that we can have another conversation. We're one of many in the future, because I feel like we have a lot more great things to talk about.
well, the feeling is
So
mutual,
thank you.
man, and I might have to pick your brain on some lifting stuff. So, um,
I'm down. Let's do it.
thanks so much
Maybe we
for
can talk
coming.
about physical power next.
Yes, indeed.
Let's do it.
Um,
All right, brother.
thanks so much for listening, everyone. Take care.